The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is highly controversial in Malaysia. The Malaysian government has committed to signing up for the TPPA, but this has caused a huge controversy among the NGO movement in Malaysia. Today I have two guests who will speak about this controversy and whether Malaysia is doing the right thing by signing up for the TPPA. My first guest is Professor Sufian Jusoh from Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia, and my second guest is YB Charles Santiago, the Member of Parliament for Klang. Malaysia is going to more or less has agreed, at least in terms of federal government, to support the TPPA. So can you tell us why should Malaysia join TPPA?
I think for me, my motivation is simple. We need to advance market access for Malaysian businesses and services. For example, there are a few things which are not covered by ASEAN, like government procurement. The liberalization of services is quite slow, even at the WTO. So we need to expand the horizon. And number two, another motivation is for transparency, rule of law, the higher level of regulatory governance. These are another motivation. The third motivation is for upscaling of technology. We need people to be more advanced in technology uptake, to be able to work in the higher level of skill and technology-driven economy, key economy. And then another issue is, of course, to ensure that the future is driven with a diversified economy. At the moment we see, these few days, you see the moment the oil is down, the ringgit is down. So if you have a more diversified economy, then the chance is we have more stability with less reliant on oil and gas activities.
So YB Charles, why shouldn't we join the TPPA?
First, I think this is not a trade agreement. This is really not a trade agreement. If it was a trade agreement, then all we need is 6 chapters or maybe 7 chapters and we are done, and there will be no argument. It's just about reduction of tariffs and maybe making it more efficient, to make the system work more efficiently. But in my view, this is not a trade agreement. It's an agreement in order to regulate the government, and therefore I think there's a need for further scrutiny, and there's a need for further study of the agreement itself, both by government as well as by the larger civil society. Now, why do I say that? For example, if you look at the issue of medicine, you need to read 7 chapters of the 30 chapters that already exist in the agreement itself. And these are legal texts. These are legal texts which most people don't understand. Even lawyers who are specializing in various areas will not be able to understand in its entirety, in toto. For example, if you look at the intellectual property rights chapter, you have 5 big issues though. You have copyright, you have patent here including biologics and plant variety, you have trademarks, you have geographic indication, and you have internet service provider. Huge chunks. And it is so specialized, it's got its own discipline, it's got its own controversies, and you don't expect the Malaysian public, including the government, to understand the implications of it in a 5-week period. Although, of course, these whole negotiations have been negotiated for the last 5 years in secret, but I think pushing it through or fast-tracking it through Parliament tomorrow and the day after will be a major big disservice, because the implications are serious. The question I have will be, among the many questions I have, will be one: will Malaysia be able to regulate the medicine of prices in 10 years from now? And will that invite a challenge by big corporations though?
If we have all these problems, then how do you account for the fact that countries like Vietnam and Indonesia and Philippines have announced that they're quite happy to join the bandwagon?
So, for example, in the case of Vietnam is largely the incentive to join the TPPA is because of its problem with China. And therefore there is actually a link to America's geopolitical interest in the region, and Vietnam actually is facing major threats from China from a security point of view. So they have a lot to gain if they agree with the United States, and especially now where you have Ashton Carter, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, saying that the TPP will also have a security component to it. A security component to it, which means that it will become like a NAFTA type approach, where NAFTA used to be trade investment, now it's also a security apparatus for the United States. So therefore, coming back to the question that you have, why should we join? I mean, is this a trade agreement or is it a security arrangement? I think that has to be clearly clarified. But I would think what Malaysia needs to do is to liberalize its economy based on its own competitive advantage. Though. You do not have to sign a foreign an agreement on transparency or even on corruption if you do it when you can do it on your own. But you're not willing to deal with your 1MDB controversy, which actually is a big problem to the economy. But you want to go and sign agreements where you are giving this idea to the world that we are committed to corruption, to fighting corruption. It is a contradiction. It's really a contradiction though. So therefore, if the Malaysian government is very serious about dealing with corruption and transparency, the first thing they should do is, one, make SPRM accountable to Parliament and not to the Prime Minister. So make the changes internally and not to use the easy way out by signing on to agreements that actually makes no, but it's not binding on the country. The corruption is not binding. The chapter on corruption is not binding. So it's okay.
Yes. Sufian, I think one of the arguments put forward by the Malaysian government is that we have to sign this agreement partly because one of the conditions of the TPPA is that if you come in and sign the second or third round, you have to agree to all the previous arrangements that was made. So it's better to get into the door early. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think from the international agreement perspective of negotiation, if you join any agreement at the very early stage, we have the experience of joining the WTO through the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. So we are the original member of the WTO in 1995. If you do this at the very early stage, you had the opportunity of negotiating the terms, like what the government, the negotiators, I think generally have been doing it quite. They have listened. The government have listened to some parts of the public's concern, like tobacco trade is out. It's a Malaysian initiative. It's not. Yeah, it should. The original plan is tobacco trade is to be there, and then another issue which I think which has been quite in a way well negotiated is the much watered down intellectual property provisions. I do agree with YB Charles that there are a lot of issues which need to be explained to the general public on the various chapters, but there has been some watered down. And if you join at a later stage, upon the agreement has been signed and concluded, then you have to accede to the whole agreement without the ability to negotiate any of the original terms. And then what will happen is you will have to renegotiate other terms with any one or all of the original members. So they will demand and say, look, okay, if you want to come in, then not only you have to agree on the whole text, but I want you to agree on new terms. This is what happened to China when they joined the WTO at a later stage. It's quite unfortunate because China was the original member of GATT and then they withdrew. Then they came back after the WTO had been coming into place. So they had to renegotiate terms. Okay, that's fine. China is big, is economically strong, powerful. But I'm talking about, say, Laos. I was involved with Laos and Vietnam in some parts of the accession to the WTO. They had to negotiate with countries like, we expect people like America or Europe to give problems to Laos. No. The one that gave a lot of problems to Laos was Ukraine. Ukraine had very little trade with Laos, but they imposed few conditions, which Laos found it quite difficult. Of course, finally they became members. So these are the issues like, it's chicken and egg, but it's not really chicken and egg, but there are really an options whether you want to join now or you join later. And I think politically for the current government, it's a good decision to join now rather than later, because there are various issues which had to be negotiated. Bumiputra, for example. If they don't negotiate now, I think they wouldn't get Bumiputra to be excluded. State-owned enterprises. Many state-owned enterprises are excluded from the coverage. Khazanah is not part of the deal. Then you see the exclusion of KWSP, Tabung Haji and all this stuff. Otherwise, it's going to be very tough for the Malaysian negotiators to go and negotiate something which are politically sensitive for the government.
Coming back to YB Chow's point that this is really not a trade agreement, it's actually more of a political security arrangement. What do you have to say to that?
For me, it's simple. This is trade and investment. Of course, there are other issues surrounding the region, like the Chinese expansion in the South China Sea, which require a lot of political and security intervention. But I guess we have to look at it from this perspective. It's geopolitical with trade and investment component in it. And this is the way things are being played at the moment. But I do not see that this is purely American. This is an arrangement between APEC member countries. For me, there are other chapters which are not in the original trade terms, like not part of the WTO, for example, investment, trade facilitation, competition policy. These are important issues. Government procurement, I am pro the government procurement chapter because this open up reform in the government procurement process. Had it not been for the GP chapter, then we might not be able to see some reform, at least some reform in the government procurement process. For example, under the current arrangement, without the TPP, you cannot even question the tender board. Yeah, it says the decision of the tender board is final. You cannot question them. But now with the TPP, we are going to have a system where contractors or bidders can question, why don't I get it? You explain to me why.
So YB Charles, I think if you look at the general consensus among the NGOs opposing the TPPA, it comes out essentially to three things. They're very worried about the issue of transparency, that's number one. Secondly, I think they worry about the price of drugs or pharmaceuticals in the future. And the third thing they always keep harping about, or they keep talking about, of course, is the investment settlement dispute mechanism. Can you go through each of these points quickly, and what is the position of the NGO community towards these 3 points?
I think basically you're looking at maths. You're looking at TRIPS plus provisions, which has a tendency to one to do evergreening, number two extension and patent protection, and you see that beginning 2000, where you have a TRIPS plus provision in a US agreement with Jordan. Okay, and therefore the fear is among the NGOs that 10 years from now, or 10 years from 2018, or 7 years from 2018, you'll have a similar situation in Malaysia. Now this is serious because already now medicine in Malaysia is expensive. For the 10 most used medicine in Malaysia, compared to the Australia, for example, we pay more by 30 to 148% already. So the fear is now the cost will escalate beyond belief and people will not be able to get affordable medicine. And also, when you hear stories like, when you read statements from the New Zealand Prime Minister saying that prices will definitely increase, patent protection will definitely be extended, then you begin to ask the question, who's telling the truth, Malaysia or New Zealand?
What's the issue with the investment dispute mechanism?
I think the issue of investment is a very critical one. Is something that you don't find in the WTO, as Prof. Sufian said, but you find in the FTAs. You find in FTAs, and it's a controversy all over the world, even including governments as well. Some governments don't subscribe to it. Indonesia does not subscribe to it. South Africa, Brazil do not subscribe to it, but Malaysia does. Now, what it does is, you, a government, a sovereign government, can be sued by a foreign investor, a foreign entrepreneur can sue you. This privilege is only given to foreign entrepreneurs, not to local businessmen though. That's number one. Number two, what it does is, it restricts government's ability to make policies in the interest of people. A case in point is Australia versus Philip Morris. Philip Morris, where the government of Australia said, in the interest of public health, we want to introduce plain packaging. Now, plain packaging is good because it will reduce the number of people who are going to smoke. And that has benefits for people as well as government expenditure. But Philip Morris said, no, this will violate our profits. And therefore, through an agreement in Hong Kong, a BIT agreement in Hong Kong, they actually challenged the government of Australia. Now, before the challenge took place, the case was taken up by Philip Morris in the Supreme Court of Australia, and the Australian highest courts ruled in favour of the government, which said that the government has a right to make public health policies. But despite that, Philip Morris brought the government of Australia to the International Arbitration Tribunal. And in so doing, the government so far, the government of Australia has spent 51 million Aussie dollars just in payment for the lawyers. The question is this: when a private entrepreneur, a foreign entrepreneur, can sue your government, can push aside the decision of the Supreme Court of Australia in this case, and number two, to challenge decisions made by Parliament, then what you have done is you have created a supranational institution, and therefore that undermines the government and, most importantly, the policy-making space of government.
Sufian, how do you answer that?
On the price of medicine, the way I read the investment chapter, the IP chapter is, we have the flexibilities as given by TRIPS, including the Doha Declaration. But we are not an LDC anymore. We are an upper middle income country. So the flexibility has under TRIPS has already expired for us. But the way I read it, data protection, for example, has already been given since 2011. And out of this, only about 30 plus pharmaceutical registered using this system. And out of this, only 3 are from TPP countries. The rest are European. So the way I see is this: we need to look at how the medicine is procured for public purposes. Yeah, because we can obtain generics using compulsory licensing. See, we have 2 experience on HIV drugs, but none of these were procured from Malaysian companies. They were procured from Indian companies. We have to build up the capabilities and expertise of Malaysian companies to produce generics, number 1. Number 2, we have to look at how the pharmaceuticals are procured for government hospitals, so that there is no, in Malay we call it ketirisan, which then lead to higher procurement price, which then lead to the higher cost of pharmaceutical at government hospital.
What about the issues raised by the investment settlement disputes?
Okay, investment chapter, this is a very sensitive investment, a very sensitive issue. It has been discussed everywhere, not just at the TPP, even at UNCTAD, for example. We have, I sit in the expert group on this reform process. We are having another meeting in March. There have been many suggestions, and I think if you look at the original, the older generation, the TPP provision on SDS has been restricted in the sense that you have fork in the road clause. If you choose to go to the domestic court, you can no longer go to arbitration, to international arbitration. This is what happened in Philip Morris. Philip Morris relied on the older generation, Hong Kong, Australia, so they had that opportunity. Number 2, we now have amicus curiae opportunities for NGOs to go and provide opinions if they want to. Hearings will be open to public, and then arbitrators will have to have certain qualifications. All these concerns raised by the NGOs, by the investment community, by the government have been addressed to a certain extent and taken into account. Another issue which I think is very important for the government beyond the ISDS is to develop the investor retention mechanism. This is a new thing. We are developing this at the World Bank, but we hope Malaysia will take it up, because this will then provide a good management of investor grievance. When investors complain, you cannot be pushing papers. You cannot be pushing around different departments. This is not my problem, because problems start when people do not see that this is an important issue.
YB Charles, the reality of the world is that you really cannot separate economic issues or trade issues from political issues. So I understand the point you're making that perhaps the TPP has a wider political agenda, but we live in a world where, whether you like it or not, politics and economics are always mixed in together.
I think if you look at the carve-outs or the gains that Malaysia states will gain, which is really carve-out of what they have achieved with the other countries, I'm not really sure they will lead to the gains for Malaysia though. It appears more like it is a support system for cronies in Malaysia though. For example, why would something like a public-private partnership be carved out? I mean, it should be made public. If you are talking about transparency, then public-private partnership should be made public. Information regarding it, agreements regarding it, the cost regarding a particular project should be made public. Why a carve-out for a private-public partnership though? And as you know, most of government procurement is largely benefits the UMNO boys and not all of Malays though. So if it's going to only benefit the UMNO boys, why is it then a benefit to the Malaysian economy? How does it create more wealth in the Malaysian economy when essentially this is all going to be transfers? So I'm not so sure. And Prof made a very important point about the carve-out of tobacco. Actually, there is a carve-out on tobacco, and it's largely from the Malaysian government, and you must thank them for that. But it's not a complete carve-out, because there is also allows for tobacco leaf growers. They've been left out from the carve-out, and they technically can use the ISDS against the government. So Philip Morris can actually have a production center which they own through subsidiaries who are leaf growers, and they can use that to go after the government though. So the carve-out really is not really that strong, I think, in my view though. So if you want to do a carve-out because you want to create an efficient economy, I can understand that. But and given the Malaysian history, the carve-out essentially is to protect not the Bumiputras though, UMNO cronies though. This is where it is going to come back to bite the economy itself.
Now, what about the earlier point by Professor Sufian that whether you like it or not, the TPPA over the long run will impose some sort of market discipline, and that right now in the Malaysian system, if you don't have an external body, it's very, very difficult to reform the system. So therefore, you need some sort of push externally in order to reform the system. Even though you may not get a full reform, at least you can start the reform process.
It's interesting what you're saying, because beneath underlying what the question that you're raising is, you're assuming and you are already stating that change will not come to Malaysia from the government or the people itself. It has to be imposed from the outside though. Now, after 58 years of independence, if this is where we are going as a nation, we have failed though. And countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, who are developing countries on the other side, they are on top of the supply chain, which means they control IPR, they control new products, they control the new processes. We are the bottom of the supply chain, where we provide cheap labor, and we're competing based on cheap labor with Australia, New Zealand, with Vietnam. Malaysia is competing with Vietnam based on cheap labor. So you have two countries which are asymmetry and whose needs are very different. So the rules that you have set, which is the TPP rules, is not going to work. Is not going to lead to equal outcome, but a very unequal outcome though. I think that's the way it's shaping up to be though.
So how do you answer that? The fact that within TPP there's such variety of countries. You got first world country trying to negotiate a trade pact with third world country. So how do you answer the question that he raised that ultimately it is the first world country who will end up winning?
I'm still hopeful and very. I'm still hoping that by 2020 we become a developed high-income nation, and I think that's the spirit shared by the negotiators when they come to the negotiating table. That hopefully by 2020. We will be, or beyond 2020, but not a long time from now, that we will be a developed nation, high-income state, high-income economy. But this is an opportunity to push ourselves from the outside, that we have to be participating in the global value chain, regional value chain, beyond our comfort zone. Because if we don't have this pressure, we will be staying within our comfort zone. Never mind, we can continue with low skill, foreign worker driven electronics and other kind of industries. We will continue with whatever that things are being done because we don't like external pressure, which lead to transparency, lead to some kind of reform. So this will provide some kind of wake-up call for those who have been in slumber for a very long time, people who live in comfort. Yeah, people who work hard, they will continue working hard. But people who live in comfort, all of a sudden they get a knock on their head and say, I have to, work a bit differently because 20 years down the road, government procurement agreement will then, lower the threshold and change the way I do things. I meet with young entrepreneurs. Many of them are excited because they are involved in technology. They see things that apps, for example, or animation, content business, they are excited about this. Of course, we have to provide safeguards. This is very important. I mentioned already in investment chapter, we have to make sure that although it's not part of the TPP, investor retention mechanism should be there. This is not part of the agreement, but this is a safeguard that we have to think about. We have to think about safeguarding the rural people, pakcik-makcik in Felda, pakcik-makcik in Kampung. How are they going to benefit from this? We do not want only people in the urban area, middle class, upper middle class aristocrats to benefit from this. So we have to develop skills, be more inclusive in our approach, irrespective of race, but based on social approach. That's the way I see it.
I think the point that Prof is making is an important one, though. I think what we need to do is improve our system of education. This is key in my view, though. Recently, the World Bank guy from Malaysia, appointment from Malaysia, said the education system in Malaysia is rotten even compared to the household debt that you have, though. That says where the problem lies. So instead of we looking inwards and saying, hey, listen, we need to improve our system of education, we need to open up our universities, we need to allow our universities to develop new technologies, fund them sufficiently, take away all the laws that restricts them, allow them to have this joint venture between business and universities, allow for new development of products and processes and so on, in innovation and so on. That's where we should be going, as opposed to where we have gone. Until we don't resolve the basic problems that we have, the problems facing our economy that we already have, TPP is not going to solve it, though. It's just going to make it worse for you.
In a nutshell, in one sentence, why should Malaysia join TPPA?
Because this is an opportunity to diversify and reform the economy.
In one sentence, why should Malaysia join TPPA?
That's a tough one, though. I think Malaysia the Malaysian government needs to look at itself and ask the simple question, though. Why are we not reforming our own economy in places where you know exactly what you need to do, but using a foreign or a trade agreement to do the work? So the question, the answer would be, why are we allowing a trade agreement to dictate terms on how we discipline ourselves, our school system, as opposed to we ourselves undertaking that process of change?
Yes. It is obvious that there was no core agreement, but I'm very glad that both of you are here to share your insights with the Malaysian public. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks
for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, Ravi.